I had been driving for hours along Route 19, a stretch of highway that feels like it has no beginning and no end. It was one of those nights when the darkness doesn't just surround you, it swallows you. The kind of black that makes you forget the sun ever existed. My headlights carved only a narrow tunnel through the void, and everything beyond that pale beam might as well have been the bottom of an ocean. The road itself shimmered faintly from an earlier rain, a slick ribbon reflecting my own movement back at me like some endless, trembling mirror. The air inside the car smelled faintly of stale coffee and wet asphalt. Every time I inhaled, I caught the ghost of gas station disinfectant from the stop I had made hours earlier. The heater hummed against the cold, but it only half warmed the cabin. There was still a damp chill that clung to the fabric of the seats. The wipers clicked lazily across the windshield, a slow metronome counting the distance between me and anywhere else. I was somewhere between counties, far from any town lights, when I first saw the figure. A faint silhouette at the edge of the high beams, barely a smudge against the black. At first I thought it might be a road sign, or a crooked tree trunk leaning too close to the asphalt. But as I drew closer, the shape sharpened into the unmistakable outline of a person standing beside the shoulder. The figure didn't wave, didn't step forward, just stood there, motionless, like a cutout from a darker piece of night. A hitchhiker. Their posture was wrong in a way I couldn't name at first, too straight, too still, as though balanced on an invisible string. I slowed almost without thinking, tires hissing against the wet road. The idea of passing someone stranded out here felt cruel, even as a thin coil of unease tightened in my stomach. As my headlights washed over the figure, I caught a better glimpse. A man, maybe, or someone with a narrow frame wrapped in a long coat that brushed against their knees. The coat looked heavy, outdated, the fabric a color I couldn't quite pin down in the bleached beam of the lights, gray, or maybe brown, or maybe something that only existed in moonless dark. Their head was slightly tilted, chin down, as though studying the pavement. I rolled to a stop a few yards ahead and leaned over to unlock the passenger door. The sound of the mechanism clicking open echoed too loudly inside the car, a sharp metallic snap that seemed to linger. I waited, expecting the figure to move. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked, and the hitchhiker slid inside without a word. The smell hit first. Not unpleasant, but strange, a mixture of damp wool, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like iron left in rain. They settled into the seat with a kind of slow, deliberate grace, coat folding neatly over their knees. The door shut with a soft thud that felt heavier than it should. I pulled back onto the road. The tires splashed through shallow puddles, sending up thin curtains of mist that caught the glow of the taillights. The hitchhiker remained perfectly silent. I could hear the faint rasp of fabric whenever they shifted, but otherwise there was nothing. No greeting, no explanation, not even the subtle sounds of breathing. It was as if the presence beside me existed in a vacuum. The further we drove, the thicker the air seemed to become. The heater still blew its lukewarm breath, but the chill clung tighter, seeping into my sleeves and fingertips. My own breathing felt loud, ragged, a private noise I couldn't hide. Every so often I flicked my eyes toward the passenger seat, expecting to meet a face. But the hitchhiker kept their head slightly turned toward the window, the brim of some unseen hood or shadow hiding their features. The road stretched on in a monotone rhythm, lines of faded paint passing like a slow pulse. Occasionally a patch of fog would drift across the asphalt, curling in the beams like pale smoke. In those moments, the hitchhiker's silhouette blurred and reformed, as if the mist was testing the edges of their shape. I tried to focus on driving, but the silence pressed harder with every mile. The wipers squeaked. The tires hummed. My heartbeat thudded against the thin fabric of my shirt. I became aware of tiny details I usually ignored. The faint rattle of a loose vent, the faint chemical sweetness of the dashboard plastic, the way the steering wheel leather felt slightly tacky beneath my palms. All of it sharper, as if the world had narrowed to a single fragile line of awareness. Somewhere past a mile marker I couldn't read, I noticed something strange in the glass of the passenger window. The reflection of my own headlights against the black beyond showed a faint shimmer where the hitchhiker's face should have been. Not a reflection of features, just an empty smear, as though the glass refused to capture them. I blinked, telling myself it was the angle, the condensation, the fog. But the smear remained, a blank patch of absence against the shifting night. I tried to speak then, some meaningless attempt to pierce the quiet. But when I opened my mouth, the sound caught in my throat. It was as if the air itself was too thick to carry words. Only a small breath escaped, a faint exhale that felt swallowed before it reached the space between us. The miles bled together. The highway signs became rarer, then vanished altogether. Even the faint glow of distant farmhouses disappeared, leaving only the endless dark and the steady sweep of the headlights. The fuel gauge ticked lower. I began to wonder if I had somehow left the real road behind, driving into some forgotten corridor that existed only to keep moving. At some point, I realized the hitchhiker's coat was dry. Not a single dark patch from the earlier rain. Not a glimmer of dampness where the fog had kissed the glass. The fabric looked untouched, as if the weather itself refused to cling to them. I gripped the wheel tighter. The leather creaked under my palms. The smell of iron grew stronger, threading through the heater's warm breath until it tasted like blood on the back of my tongue. I don't remember deciding to stop. My foot simply eased off the gas, and the car coasted to the shoulder. The engine idled in a low, uneasy growl. I turned to look fully at my passenger for the first time. The seat was empty. The coat, the faint smell, the shadowed outline all gone. The door was still locked from the inside. No sound of movement. No whisper of fabric. Only the faint imprint of pressure on the seat cushion, slowly rising as though the air itself was exhaling. I sat there for a long time, staring at that empty space, the highway stretching silent and endless in both directions. The heater ticked softly as it cooled. Somewhere in the dark, a single drop of water fell from the edge of the roof and struck the hood with a hollow ping. Eventually, I drove on. The road carried me forward, but something about it had changed. Every mile marker looked unfamiliar. Every bend in the highway curved just a little too sharply, as though the world had been rewritten in the time it took to blink. When I finally reached the next town, dawn was bleeding into the sky, a gray, colorless light that felt like the inside of an old photograph. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and stepped out. The cold air hit me with the smell of wet earth and distant pine. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the empty passenger seat through the smeared glass. On the door handle, faint but unmistakable, was a single print. Not a handprint, not a smudge of dirt, just the faint outline of something long and narrow, pressed into the metal like the memory of fingers that had never been flesh. I never saw anyone when I stopped for gas again. Not the hitchhiker, not a single car pulling in or out. Only the slow hiss of the pump and the echo of my own breath in the cold morning air. And even now, months later, I sometimes catch the scent of damp wool and iron when I drive at night. It creeps into the vents, subtle and sharp, a smell that does not belong. And every time it happens, I glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see a figure sitting there, silent and still, waiting for me to keep driving down a road that never truly ends. I remember the smell of wet asphalt before I remember the road itself. It had rained earlier that evening, just a light drizzle, but enough to leave a slick sheen on the blacktop that caught the glow of our headlights like stretched glass. My wife and I had been driving for hours, making our way back from a quiet weekend in the mountains. The air inside the car was heavy with that damp smell of clothes that had been too close to a campfire, mixed with the faint metallic tang of the defroster. We were both tired, the kind of fatigue that seeps into your bones and makes every mile feel longer than the last. The highway had been our companion for most of the trip, long, straight, and familiar. But sometime after midnight, the navigation on my phone lost its signal. The screen froze, and the thin blue line that was supposed to guide us home simply vanished. I remember leaning closer to the windshield as the road curved unexpectedly, narrowing between a dense wall of pines. The night felt thick there, the trees swallowing what little moonlight filtered through the low clouds. There was no sound except for the low hum of the engine and the soft hiss of tires over damp pavement. That was when the car appeared. Its headlights flared in the rearview mirror without warning, two pale discs cutting through the darkness. It wasn't close enough to be threatening, just a distant presence, a reminder that we weren't completely alone on this forgotten stretch of road. Something about the way it held its distance unsettled me. No matter how much I pressed on the gas or eased off, the glow of those headlights remained fixed, neither gaining nor falling behind. They floated there, unwavering, like a pair of eyes watching us from just beyond reach. We reached an intersection, the kind of lonely fork that shouldn't exist in the middle of nowhere. There were no signs, no lights, only the faint reflection of our own beams glinting off wet gravel. The main road seemed to veer left, a gentle curve swallowed by the forest. But a smaller lane branched sharply to the right, a narrow ribbon of asphalt that disappeared into a slope of deeper black. The car behind us slowed as well, its lights pulsing faintly through the mist. Something inside me tightened. Without thinking, I guided our car to the right. It wasn't a decision so much as a reflex. Maybe I wanted to see if the other car would follow. Maybe I simply wanted to escape its steady presence. Either way, the turn felt wrong the moment the tires left the main road. The pavement beneath us changed texture, rougher and uneven, the hum of the tires replaced by a faint rattle. Trees pressed closer, their wet branches bending low as if to watch us pass. The air grew colder, damp enough that I could taste the mineral bite of wet earth through the vents. I glanced in the mirror. The headlights were gone. At first, I thought they had slowed to let us go. But as the seconds stretched, there was only darkness behind us. No faint glow, no distant beams bleeding through the mist. I eased off the accelerator and scanned the road, expecting the light to reappear. Nothing. The blacktop behind us might as well have been an endless tunnel swallowed by shadow. My chest tightened with a cold realization. Whoever they were, they had vanished the instant we left the main road. We continued forward because there was nowhere else to go. The lane twisted sharply, sloping downward through a ravine lined with moss-slick rocks. The smell of wet leaves thickened until it felt like breathing through damp cloth. The only illumination came from our headlights, their pale cones catching fragments of white bark and sudden bursts of reflective eyes from unseen animals. The GPS remained blank, the screen locked in a frozen map of a road we had left behind miles ago. Every bend felt sharper than the last. At times the trees leaned so close that their branches scraped against the roof with a dry, brittle whisper. It sounded like fingernails dragging along metal. My wife sat rigid beside me, silent except for the faint, uneven rhythm of her breathing. I gripped the wheel tighter with each turn, the leather slick beneath my damp palms. The road never straightened, never widened, just a series of curves that spiraled deeper into the woods. A smell began to creep into the car, faint but unmistakable. Damp stone, stagnant water, and something older, like wood left to rot in a sealed room. It carried a sweetness that made the back of my throat tighten. I rolled down the window for fresh air and was met with a wall of soundless cold. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the soft hiss of the tires on damp asphalt and the quiet pulse of our own breath. We drove for what felt like hours, though the clock on the dashboard barely moved. At some point, I realized we hadn't passed a single sign of life. Not a house, not a street lamp, not even the reflective markers that usually line back roads. There were no crossroads, no driveways, no breaks in the trees. Only the road, endlessly curving, as if it existed for us alone. The unease that had been crawling along my spine sharpened into something colder when I noticed the temperature gauge. It had been steady all night, but now it dipped slowly, the blue needle sinking toward the edge of the dial. The heater blew air that was lukewarm at best, carrying that damp mineral smell no matter how high I turned the fan. My wife rubbed her arms, her skin prickling with goosebumps even under her jacket. I pressed the accelerator, desperate to find the main road again, but the lane resisted, coiling like a snake that refused to let us go. Then came the sound, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, buried beneath the engine's steady drone. It wasn't mechanical. It was softer, like a vibration in the air, as though something enormous was moving just beyond the reach of the headlights. The noise grew stronger as we rounded another bend, the pavement slick with rain that hadn't fallen in hours. My ears began to ache with a pressure I couldn't explain, like descending too quickly in an airplane. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles white against the dark leather. We reached a clearing at last, a sudden break where the trees pulled back to reveal an open stretch of road. For a heartbeat, I thought we had escaped, but the relief vanished as quickly as it came. The asphalt ended abruptly a few yards ahead, crumbling into a patch of black gravel that dissolved into wet grass. Beyond it stretched nothing, just a wall of forest and a sky so dark it seemed to swallow the stars. I stopped the car and killed the engine. The silence that followed was total, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own heartbeat. The hum had vanished. The forest stood perfectly still. Even the mist hung motionless, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I flicked on the high beams and stared at the empty road, hoping to catch a sign, a marker, anything that might explain where we were. There was nothing. No car behind us. No tracks in the gravel. No sound except for the soft tick of cooling metal. I don't remember making the decision to turn back, only the grinding crunch of gravel under the tires as I reversed into the curve. The road was waiting, silent and endless, a black ribbon leading back into the forest. But as we began to climb the incline, A strange realization chilled me more than the cold air ever could. The lane behind us was not the same one we had followed down. The curves were wrong, the trees positioned differently, their branches arching overhead in patterns I didn't remember. It was as if the road had rearranged itself in the darkness. We drove for what felt like an eternity, but the forest never thinned. The temperature continued to drop until frost formed on the inside of the windshield. The smell of damp would grow heavier, sharp enough to sting my eyes. I tried to track the time, but the dashboard clock flickered and reset itself over and over, the numbers melting into a blur of meaningless digits. My phone remained dead, its black screen reflecting only my own pale face. At some point, minutes or hours, I can't say, the trees began to recede. A faint glow appeared in the distance, not the harsh white of headlights, but a softer, amber light, like the glow of a street lamp filtered through fog. We followed it without question, hearts pounding with a desperate hope. The road straightened, widened, and finally merged with a familiar highway lined with reflective markers and the faint smell of exhaust. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. Behind us, there was only darkness. No sign of the narrow lane we had followed. No intersection. No headlights. We never spoke about that night again, not because we agreed to forget, but because describing it would have meant admitting that it happened. The GPS never showed a record of the detour. Maps of the area revealed no side roads, no hidden lanes branching from the highway. And yet, sometimes, when I drive late at night and catch a pair of headlights in the mirror, I feel the same cold weight settle in my chest. I remember the car that followed us to the fork, the wrong turn we should never have taken, and the way those lights vanished into the mist as if they were never there at all. Because whoever, or whatever, was driving that other car never followed us down the road, and we never saw it again. I have spent most of my adult life behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, crossing endless highways and slipping through forgotten backroads that seem to stretch into nowhere. Long-haul trucking gives you a lot of time to think, too much sometimes. The hum of the engine becomes a heartbeat, the night sky a silent witness. You start to believe that the road itself is alive, breathing beneath the asphalt, waiting to show you things you'd rather not see. It was early November when I picked up a late-night haul from a distribution center just outside Amarillo. The air carried the sharp smell of distant rain, though the sky above was a dull charcoal gray, moonless and heavy. My trailer was supposed to be completely empty. It was a simple repositioning job. Drop an empty at a yard 300 miles east so another driver could load it the next morning. Easy miles, easy pay. No stops, no freight, just me, the road, and an aluminum box trailing silently behind. The night began the way most nights do. The dashboard glow lit the cab in a soft green, gauges and needles humming along like patient guardians. The tires sang a low, steady drone over the blacktop, blending with the deep rumble of the diesel engine. Occasionally a gust of wind would rattle through the side mirrors and moan against the trailer's thin walls. I was used to it all, the smells of warm rubber, the faint chemical bite of diesel fumes, the dry taste of stale coffee on my tongue. 2 hours into the drive, I left the highway for a state route that cut across a patchwork of farmland and scrubby plains. Out there, the world turns empty in ways that make you question whether you've slipped out of reality. The road was a single strip of cracked asphalt flanked by skeletal trees and fields of dead grass that shivered under the touch of the wind. My headlights painted everything in shades of white and silver, while the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the beams whole. I remember glancing into my side mirrors and noticing how the trailer looked like a black monolith against the faint shimmer of the stars. An empty box, no cargo, no reason for concern. But as I rounded a shallow curve, a faint sound reached my ears, soft, irregular, and out of place. Knock. It was so faint at first that I thought it might be the road, maybe a rock kicked up by the tires. Then it came again. Knock, knock. Slow, deliberate, like knuckles rapping against a hollow surface. My stomach tightened. Inside the trailer, there shouldn't have been anything capable of making that noise. No freight, no loose pallets, nothing. I eased my foot off the accelerator, letting the truck coast while I strained to listen over the engine's low growl. The night outside was a vacuum. Another knock. Louder this time, deep enough to vibrate through the metal frame of the cab. It carried a resonance that felt wrong, organic somehow, like the sound of skin on metal. I told myself it was probably the trailer doors shifting in the wind. Maybe a latch had come loose, and the air currents were teasing it. But a good driver knows the language of his rig, and this wasn't it. The knocks weren't random. They came in pairs, each separated by a few seconds of silence. Knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock. I kept driving. Stopping on an isolated stretch of road at night is something every trucker dreads. You never know who, or what, might be waiting in the dark. Still, the sound gnawed at me. My hands tightened around the wheel, the leather cold and slightly sticky with dried sweat. The smell inside the cab began to change. It was subtle at first, a damp, metallic odor that reminded me of old coins and wet earth. My heater was running low, blowing air that carried the faint tang of rust. I checked the vents, thinking maybe moisture had seeped into the system, but everything looked normal. Then came a different sound, a scraping, like fingernails dragging across the inside wall of the trailer. Long, slow, deliberate. It started near the front, right behind the cab, and slid toward the rear doors. The hairs on my arms prickled as I imagined something moving along that empty corridor of steel. I flicked my high beams across the deserted road ahead. The light revealed nothing but cracked pavement, frostbitten grass, and the distant silhouette of bare trees. No houses, no other vehicles, just me and the darkness pressing in. The knocking returned, harder this time. Knock, knock. The trailer shuddered with each impact, a deep vibration that rattled through the steering column and into my bones. My mouth went dry. Instinct told me to pull over, but reason screamed to keep going. If someone had managed to sneak inside back at the yard, I didn't want to meet them in the middle of nowhere. Another 10 miles crawled by. My eyes kept flicking to the side mirrors, but the trailer's surface reflected only the blinding glare of my own headlights. No movement, no shadow, yet the sounds persisted, knocks, scrapes, and something else. Breathing. I swear I could hear it. A slow, heavy inhale followed by a wet exhale, muffled by layers of steel. It matched the rhythm of the knocks, as if whatever was inside was gathering strength between each strike. I finally spotted a wide gravel turnout and guided the rig off the road. The tires crunched over loose stones as I eased to a stop. I killed the engine. Instantly, the world fell into a silence so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. No wind. No insects. Nothing. And then, knock. One single, sharp rap from inside the trailer. I climbed down from the cab, the cold air slapping my face with the scent of wet soil and distant rain. The gravel shifted under my boots as I circled toward the rear. The trailer loomed above me, its metal skin glinting faintly under the starlight. The air felt heavier here, thick with a damp chill that clung to my jacket. I placed a hand on the door latch. The steel was icy, almost wet. For a long moment, I just stood there listening. My breath fogged in the air. Somewhere inside, something shifted, soft, like fabric brushing against metal. I yanked the latch and swung the doors open. The trailer gaped wide, its interior swallowing the pale beam of my flashlight. Empty. Just a cavern of cold aluminum panels stretching into darkness. My light revealed nothing but scuffed floorboards and faint condensation dripping from the ceiling. The smell hit me then. Stronger now, unmistakable. Damp iron and rot, like blood left to sit in stagnant water. My stomach churned. I stepped closer, shining the light along every seam and corner. No footprints. No crates. No sign of life. A sudden slam of metal startled me, so hard I nearly dropped the flashlight. The doors behind me had swung inward an inch, nudged by some unseen force. A draft, I told myself, though the night air was perfectly still. I backed out, heart hammering. I secured the latch with trembling hands and climbed back into the cab. As I turned the key, the engine coughed to life with a deep roar that felt almost comforting. I didn't care about the delivery schedule anymore. I just needed to reach the next truck stop, to be anywhere but there. The rest of the drive was a blur of tension. Every creak of the suspension, every rattle of the trailer felt magnified. I kept expecting another knock, another scrape, but nothing came. The road unwound ahead of me in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional flicker of dying streetlights. When I finally rolled into a brightly lit truck plaza hours later, relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost laughed. I parked, climbed down, and inspected the trailer once more. The smell was gone. The metal was dry and warm from the engine's heat. Inside, nothing had changed, empty walls, empty floor. Yet as I stood there, staring into that silent box of steel, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the front wall, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, were faint smudges on the floor. Not footprints exactly, but long streaks, like something had been dragged across the surface. I've hauled thousands of loads since that night. Most of them pass without incident, just endless miles and the quiet companionship of the road. But every time I pull an empty trailer now, I find myself listening a little too closely to the sounds that echo inside. The knocks were real. I felt them through the wheel, through the seat, through my bones. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the world seems to hold its breath, I swear I can still hear it. A soft, patient rhythm coming from behind me. Knock, knock. Most people imagine the late drive home as a quiet stretch of time, an empty highway where the world exhales and finally lets go of the day. For me, the night commute was a kind of ritual. It was a corridor of silence where the hum of the tires and the pulse of the dashboard clock replaced everything else. Every evening after work, I would slide behind the wheel, let the seatbelt click across my chest, and disappear into the thin blue darkness of the outskirts. The road to my apartment cut across miles of damp lowland, a patchwork of marsh and industrial decay. Factories crouched behind chain-link fences like exhausted giants, their windows black except for the occasional pulse of an emergency light. The air there always smelled faintly metallic, wet iron, old rain, and the sweet, faintly rotten scent of river water. It was a place that felt halfway between civilization and something older. A thin strip of asphalt stretched across sleeping swamps and flooded fields. Most nights were uneventful. My headlights tunneled forward, and the world beyond them ceased to exist. Occasionally I'd catch the gleam of a fox's eyes, or the brittle flutter of a plastic bag scraping across the shoulder. But that particular night, the air itself felt different before I even reached the bridge. It began with a heaviness I can only describe as a kind of pressure, like a weight settling on the hood of the car. The late summer air was thick, wet, and strangely cold against the windshield. I lowered the windows a crack, expecting the familiar smell of river mud, but instead there was only a dry, electric scent, like the seconds before a thunderstorm. The radio hissed with faint static even though the signal was strong. Every mile marker slid by slower than it should have, as if the road itself had stretched. The bridge appeared ahead as a faint gray arc rising out of the darkness. It wasn't much, just a narrow steel span with a single lane in each direction. During the day it looked tired and unremarkable, but at night it became something else entirely. The steel girders loomed like ribs in the headlights, slick with dew. Beneath it the river widened into a black expanse, swallowing the sky. I eased onto the approach, tires thumping softly against the seam where asphalt met steel. That was when I saw her. At first she was only a pale shape inside the beam of my headlights, so faint I almost mistook her for mist rising from the water. Then the figure solidified, a woman standing directly in the middle of the bridge. She faced me squarely, feet planted on the faded yellow line. Her dress was light in color, maybe white or a washed-out gray, the fabric heavy with moisture so that it clung to her legs. Her hair was long and dark, hanging straight down like wet rope. She wasn't moving. Not a shift of weight, not a flicker of recognition. Just standing there, perfectly centered, as if the bridge itself had pushed her upward from the river. My foot hovered over the brake before instinct finally forced me to slow. The tires screeched softly on the damp steel. The dashboard clock read 1:42 a.m. As the car crawled forward, the details sharpened in a way that made my stomach knot. Her skin, what little I could see of it, seemed colorless, almost reflective, like moonlight on porcelain. Her arms hung straight at her sides, fingers slightly curled. No purse, no shoes, just bare feet planted on cold metal. The dress shifted slightly in the breeze, but her body did not. I kept rolling until I was maybe 20 feet away. The headlights flooded her completely, yet she cast no clear shadow across the slick bridge deck. The light seemed to slide around her edges, failing to define them. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until the leather creaked. The silence was unbearable. No night insects, no distant highway hum, only the low hiss of my engine and the faint groan of the river current far below. It felt as if the world behind me had been swallowed whole, leaving only this narrow strip of steel suspended over black water. I waited for some sign of life, a blink, a flinch, a shift of breathing. Nothing. The human mind tries to make sense of things it doesn't understand. I told myself she might be lost, drunk, in need of help. But the deeper part of me, the part that responds before reason, knew better. Something about the angle of her head, the perfect stillness of her spine, carried a weight that no ordinary person could mimic. It was the posture of something that wanted to be mistaken for human. I lowered the window halfway. The night air rushed in, damp and metallic. It smelled of rust and river weeds and something faintly sweet, like wilted flowers left too long in stagnant water. The temperature dropped hard enough to fog the windshield's edges. The woman finally moved. It was not a natural movement. Her head tilted slightly to the side, too slow, like a pendulum finding its lowest point. Then it stayed there, angled in a way that would have hurt a living neck. Her hair slid forward, hiding her face entirely. A pulse of panic jolted through me. I pressed the accelerator just enough to make the car creep forward, intending to pass her on the right shoulder. But as soon as I shifted lanes, she slid. Not stepped, not walked, just shifted, to remain directly in my path. No sound of footsteps on steel. One moment she was in the center. The next, she occupied the exact spot I needed to cross. I stopped again. The steering wheel vibrated faintly with the idle engine. My breath condensed on the glass and drifted sideways in the draft. Every instinct screamed to reverse, to retreat into the safety of headlights and asphalt, but the narrow bridge offered no room to turn. Behind me was only a long, featureless road leading into marshland. Ahead, the woman waited. Something in the river below began to echo, a slow, rhythmic clanging like a buoy bell, though no buoys existed this far inland. Each metallic ring shivered through the bridge's steel bones, vibrating up through the tires and into my legs. With each clang, the woman's head tilted a fraction further, as if responding to a signal only she could hear. I don't remember deciding to move. My foot simply pressed the accelerator, and the car began to inch forward. The engine's growl seemed impossibly loud against the hush of the night. The woman did not retreat. She remained centered until the front bumper was less than 6 feet away. Then, without any visible step, she was gone. Not a leap over the railing, not a sudden sprint into darkness. Gone. The space where she had stood was empty, slick with condensation, reflecting the white cones of my headlights. The air smelled sharply of cold iron, as if lightning had just struck nearby. I accelerated hard, tires squealing against wet steel, and shot across the remaining span. The far end of the bridge emerged like salvation. When I reached solid asphalt, I didn't look in the mirrors. I kept driving until the bridge was a smear of shadow in the distance. Only then did I notice the clock. 1:42 a.m. Exactly the same minute I had first seen her. The entire encounter, what had felt like endless, choking minutes, had stolen no measurable time. That was weeks ago. I have crossed the bridge only once since, during daylight, when the sun turned the river to dull brown and the girders to harmless gray. No trace of footprints marked the steel deck, but sometimes, late at night when I drive a different route home, I catch a flicker of pale fabric in the corner of my headlights. Always near water, always perfectly still. And each time, the radio fills with that faint, inexplicable static, and the air tastes of rust and sweet decay, as if the river itself remembers me, and waits for the next crossing. I was 17 the night it happened, driving home from a late study session that stretched long past midnight. My small town was a 40-minute drive across state roads that cut through patches of forest and long stretches of farmland. I had driven those routes dozens of times, but the night had a strange weight to it. One of those nights where the air feels swollen with something you can't name. The sky looked bruised, the moon barely a thin smear behind a layer of dull clouds, and the trees on either side of the road swayed in uneven, twitching motions. My car was a second-hand sedan, the kind that hummed a tired tune at every bump. Inside, the heater exhaled warm, recycled air that carried a faint scent of dust and old vinyl. The dashboard clock glowed a muted green. Every few miles, the radio flickered with static, like it was trying to swallow a whisper it couldn't quite catch. By the time the gas gauge needle slid near empty, I was still 20 minutes from home. There was only one station on that stretch of road, a single island of flickering fluorescent lights floating in the middle of the dark. I'd stopped there before during the day, but never at night. As I pulled off the highway, the gravel crunched under the tires with a sound too loud for the surrounding silence. The station sat like a forgotten relic, its canopy lights buzzing in uneven pulses. One light blinked with a sickly yellow hue, while the others hummed a cold, white glare that flattened every shadow. The air smelled of damp concrete, gasoline, and something faintly metallic, like the scent of pennies rubbed between wet fingers. A lone ice freezer stood against the wall near the entrance, its surface streaked with condensation that dripped down like cold sweat. I parked beside the far pump, the one half hidden from the road by a leaning sign advertising coffee. The engine died with a low sigh, and for a moment I just sat there, my breath fogging faintly in the chilled air. The silence pressed against the car windows, broken only by the buzzing of the lights overhead. When I stepped out, the cold bit sharper than I expected. The air smelled sharper too, gasoline mixed with the earthy dampness of nearby woods. The pump handle felt slick and slightly gritty, like someone had handled it with dirty hands. I started fueling, my eyes drifting to the empty lot. The glass door of the convenience store was dark. No sign of an attendant. Inside, the shelves stood like silent sentries, rows of snacks and drinks frozen in place. The nozzle clicked off. I returned it to its cradle, my movements quick, almost frantic. Something about the stillness behind the glass unsettled me. I slid back into the car, the seat fabric cold enough to feel wet through my jeans. As I started the engine, a sound rose from somewhere beyond the canopy. It was faint, like a dry rustle of fabric dragged across asphalt. Then a soft thud, deliberate and slow. My hands tightened on the wheel. The station lot stretched empty in every direction, yet the noise felt close, like it was breathing just outside the car. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a loose sign shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. Not even a whisper moved the hanging price board. I shifted into drive, the tires crunching against the gravel. That's when I caught it, a shape at the edge of the canopy. Not quite hidden, not quite visible, just a darker slice of night pressed against the tree line. It wasn't moving. It simply existed, heavy and unnatural, like a missing piece of the world that my eyes weren't meant to find. I pressed the accelerator and rolled back onto the road, heart hammering loud enough to drown the radio static. The highway swallowed me whole, the station shrinking in the rear view until it was nothing more than a flicker of dying light. The drive home should have been familiar, but every mile felt wrong. The trees leaned closer to the pavement, their branches weaving an uneven lattice overhead. My headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, catching brief flashes of pale bark and slick pavement. Every so often, I thought I saw movement along the shoulder, a hint of motion just beyond the reach of the beams. 15 minutes later, the rain started. A thin drizzle first, like the sky clearing its throat, then heavier, until it drummed against the roof in a rhythm that sounded almost intentional. The windshield wipers smeared water into streaks of distorted light, and I gripped the wheel tighter, leaning forward as if that could help me see through the blur. When I finally turned into my neighborhood, the world felt like it had exhaled. The familiar houses, the soft orange glow of porch lights, the neat lines of trimmed hedges. Normalcy wrapped itself around me like a thin blanket. I parked in the driveway, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like streaks of rain caught in the glow of the streetlight. But as I stepped out, the pattern sharpened into something impossible to mistake. Handprints, 5 of them, smeared across the driver's side door and trailing onto the rear panel. Dark, glistening shapes that gleamed wetly under the thin drizzle. They were large, larger than my own hands, and each print was streaked with a deep, reddish sheen. The rain had begun to dilute the color, but the edges clung stubbornly, thick and sticky. My breath caught. The air smelled faintly of iron, a coppery tang that threaded through the scent of wet asphalt. I reached out before I realized what I was doing, my fingertips hovering inches above the closest print. The surface shimmered with a texture that looked almost oily, catching the streetlight in dark crimson ripples. The logical part of my mind scrambled for answers. Maybe it was paint, maybe some cruel prank. But the smell, it was wrong. Too sharp, too real. I looked around the street. Every house was still, curtains drawn, windows dark. Only the rain moved, dripping in slow, deliberate beats. The world felt narrowed to the car, the prints, and the silent houses that now seemed to be holding their breath. A shiver crawled up my spine. I thought about the station, the empty store, the faint rustle behind the canopy. Had someone been there? Hiding? Watching? My mind replayed the sound, the soft thud that followed the rustle. The way the dark shape clung to the edge of the lights. If someone had been standing near the car while I fueled, I never would have known. The pump island was lit, but beyond it, the lot melted into shadow thick enough to swallow a person whole. The realization struck like ice water. Whoever left the prints had to be there when I was. They had to be close enough to touch the car. Close enough to press their hands against the metal while I stood only a few feet away. The rain intensified, streaking the prints into long, dripping trails that snaked down the door. I backed away, my shoes slipping slightly on the slick driveway. Every instinct screamed to get inside, to lock the door, to put walls between me and the night. But I couldn't move. I kept staring at the car, waiting for some final piece of the scene to reveal itself. A shadow behind the neighbor's hedge, a figure across the street, but the night gave nothing back. Only the steady hiss of rain and the faint metallic scent that clung stubbornly to the air. Eventually, I forced myself inside, bolting the door and sliding down against it until my knees touched the floor. I sat there for what felt like hours, the house silent around me. When morning came, the prints were gone. The rain had washed them into streaks of dull brown that blended with the grime of the car door. No one else noticed. No one believed me when I tried to explain the smell, the texture, the shape of the fingers spread wide across the metal. But I remember. I remember the sound at the station, the motionless dark at the edge of the canopy. I remember the realization that someone was close enough to touch me, to press their hands against the door while I stood just feet away, unaware. And every time I drive that road at night, I feel it again, that slow, deliberate presence hiding just beyond the reach of the lights, waiting for the next car to stop. I had been driving for hours when the night finally swallowed the last signs of civilization. The highway had stretched thin, the road becoming nothing more than a ribbon of faded asphalt cutting through endless fields of shadow. My headlights swept across skeletal trees and sagging fences, catching the faint glint of dew on cold grass. The world outside my windshield felt abandoned, a wide black canvas where nothing moved but the wind. I could smell damp earth each time I cracked the window, heavy and metallic, like rain on rust. The dashboard clock glowed a dull green, reminding me that it was well past midnight, and I was alone on a road that seemed to have no end. The silence was hypnotic. My tires hummed against the pavement, a constant low vibration that blurred into the distant sigh of wind through the trees. Occasionally, a bump in the road sent a faint tremor through the steering wheel, breaking the monotony only for a second before fading back into the steady, mind-numbing rhythm. I felt as though I were the only living thing for miles, a single pulse of warmth moving through a landscape of cold emptiness. That's when I saw the lights. At first, they were nothing but faint specks in the rearview mirror, two small orbs glowing in the distant dark. They could have been anything, another traveler, a late-night trucker, someone heading home from a shift. But the way they appeared was strange. One moment, there was nothing behind me but a horizon of black. The next, two perfectly aligned lights hovered far back on the road, too sudden to be natural, as if someone had flipped a switch. I told myself it was just another car, but the longer I watched, the more something in my gut tightened. The lights didn't grow brighter the way they should have if a vehicle was catching up. They stayed fixed at a distance that felt deliberately chosen, far enough to keep me guessing, close enough to keep me from forgetting they were there. I tried to ignore them. My eyes flicked from the road ahead to the mirror and back again, but each time I looked, those lights remained, unwavering and patient. My own headlights illuminated the cracked asphalt ahead, revealing faded white lines and the occasional reflector that glimmered like the eyes of small, hidden animals. The air through the vents carried a faint chemical smell from the heater, warm but somehow sterile, as if the car itself were sealing me away from the night. And yet I felt watched. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the lights surged closer. It was instantaneous. One heartbeat they were distant, the next they filled my mirror, so bright they painted the interior of my car in a harsh white glow. My shadow danced against the windshield. The steering wheel trembled as if responding to the pressure of an invisible weight. My chest tightened. Whoever was behind me wasn't just following, they were bearing down on me with intent. I pressed the gas. The engine answered with a strained growl as the speedometer climbed. Wind began to whistle around the edges of the doors, a thin, eerie note that threaded through the mechanical rumble. Still, the lights matched me, staying close enough that I could feel the heat of their beams on the back of my neck. My own headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, but every shadow beyond that pale cone seemed to writhe with movement. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned stiff and cold. The road stretched empty ahead, no intersections, no turnoffs, just endless black. I could taste fear in my mouth, bitter like old coins. My ears caught every sound, the squeal of tires on a curve, the faint rattle of loose change in the cup holder, the low moan of the engine laboring against my panic. Then, as suddenly as they had closed in, the lights fell back. It was subtle at first, a slow retreat like the tide pulling away from shore. I dared a glance at the mirror. The headlights were smaller now, shrinking as though the road itself were stretching between us. Relief flickered through me, thin and unreliable, but it was enough to loosen my grip on the wheel. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe whoever it was had simply decided to ease off. That thought barely formed before the lights surged forward again. This time they came with a ferocity that made my heart slam against my ribs. They didn't just follow, they lunged, flooding my cabin with a white glare so blinding I could barely see the road ahead. My eyes watered. The lines on the asphalt blurred. I swerved slightly, the tires shrieking in protest, the scent of hot rubber curling through the vents like smoke. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked tight. I pushed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 80. The car vibrated as if trying to shake itself apart. Wind roared against the windows, a relentless howl that merged with the rising whine of the engine. My chest felt compressed, my pulse a frantic drum in my ears. Still, the lights stayed with me, impossibly steady, as if tethered to my rear bumper by some unseen force. I don't know how long I drove like that. Time stretched into a painful, pulsing blur. My eyes burned from staring too long, every flick of the mirror a fresh jolt of terror. Then I saw something up ahead, a curve in the road, sharp and sudden, marked by a battered sign half swallowed by weeds. I braced myself, easing the wheel just enough to follow the bend. And that's when the lights vanished. Not faded, not dimmed, vanished. One heartbeat they were there, two blazing eyes fixed on me with predatory intent. The next, nothing. The mirror reflected only blackness, so complete it looked like the glass itself had been swallowed. My own headlights continued to cut their narrow path through the dark, but behind me there was no sign of tires, no lingering glow, no sound of an engine fading into the distance. Just emptiness. I slowed, heart hammering so violently it felt like my ribs might crack. The car protested with a low groan as I eased off the gas. The silence that followed was worse than the chase. It was absolute, no chirp of insects, no rustle of branches, not even the faint hum of distant traffic. The world had gone hollow. I pulled to the shoulder and killed the engine. Immediately, the warmth inside the car bled away, replaced by a damp chill that settled into my bones. The smell of wet soil drifted in through the vents, sharp and metallic, like iron left to rust. I sat there, hands locked on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the mirror as if sheer will could force those lights to return. But the road behind me was nothing but an endless ribbon of black. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I thought about stepping out, but something primal in me resisted. The night beyond the glass felt wrong, as though it wasn't merely empty but waiting. The trees along the roadside stood motionless, their branches stiff as skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and uneven, and beneath it a faint ringing in my ears that might have been silence stretched too thin. Eventually, I restarted the car. The engine's familiar rumble felt almost comforting, a fragile barrier against the oppressive quiet. I drove on, slower this time, my eyes flicking constantly to the mirror. Nothing followed. No lights. No sign that anyone had ever been there. And yet, even now, I can still feel it. The weight of those headlights pressing against my back. The certainty that something out there saw me, chose me, and then, for reasons I can't begin to understand, let me go. Every time I drive a lonely stretch of highway at night, I find myself scanning the mirror, waiting for those sudden orbs of white to flicker into existence. Waiting for the moment when the darkness behind me isn't empty after all. Because I know what I saw, and I know they can come back. I have always hated driving long distances alone, but that night there was no other choice. The highway stretched out in a black ribbon that seemed to have no end, a narrow vein of cracked asphalt cutting through miles of unlit farmland and forgotten woods. My job had sent me to a last-minute meeting in another state, and by the time I was on my way back, the world had already surrendered to darkness. The sky was a deep, breathless void, no moon, no stars, only a thin smear of clouds that looked like smoke frozen in midair. My headlights carved a tunnel of pale gold through the dark, and everything beyond that beam existed only as suggestion. Shapes and shadows, endless and empty. The air inside the car smelled faintly of old coffee and the artificial pine of a cheap air freshener, a sharp contrast to the heavy, wet scent seeping in from the night outside whenever I cracked the window. It smelled like damp earth and asphalt baked by the day and cooled too quickly, like something alive waiting in the grass beyond the guardrail. My tires hummed against the road, a steady, low vibration that became a kind of hypnotic heartbeat. The world beyond that sound was a silent abyss. That was when I saw it for the first time. A car sat on the shoulder up ahead, its hazard lights blinking with a tired rhythm. Each flash of orange cut through the darkness, then vanished like a heartbeat made of light. As I drew closer, the details began to emerge. It was an old sedan, maybe a late 90s model, a dull gray that seemed almost the color of ash. The paint was chipped in places, and the rear bumper sagged slightly, as if it had once been hit and never repaired. The back window was half fogged, and something about the way the car sat, tilted slightly toward the ditch, gave it an abandoned look. I slowed instinctively, my foot hovering over the brake. A faint wash of unease settled over me. There was no one standing beside it, no driver waving for help, no flicker of a cell phone screen inside. Just the car, breathing light into the dark with those lazy, blinking hazards. I passed it slowly, watching in my side mirror until the last flash disappeared behind me. For a while, I tried to shake it off. Cars break down all the time, especially on lonely highways. Maybe the driver had already called for help and was waiting inside. Maybe they had walked to the nearest gas station. Still, the image of that dull gray sedan with its lopsided stance lingered in my mind, like a taste I couldn't swallow. 30 minutes later, I saw it again. It appeared ahead of me on a long, empty stretch of road, a dull gray sedan, hazards blinking in the same slow rhythm, tilted slightly toward the ditch. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until the leather creaked. It couldn't have been the same car. I had been driving steadily, no turnoffs, no side roads, just this single endless highway. And yet, every detail was identical. The chipped paint, the sagging bumper, the way the back window caught my headlights like a thin, milky eye. I drove past it, my heart thudding in a way that made the steering wheel feel like it was pulsing under my fingers. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again and again, expecting, hoping, to see some sign of life. There was nothing but the flash of those lazy hazards, beating in the dark until distance swallowed them. The next time I saw it, I felt the air inside the car change. It came less than 20 minutes later, after the road had wound through a stretch of woods where the trees pressed close, their branches knotted together like blackened bones. When the sedan appeared ahead of me for the third time, I smelled it before I even registered what I was looking at. A faint metallic tang seeped into the cabin through the vents, sharp and unmistakable, the smell of rust, of wet iron. It was the scent of old blood on a cold surface. My stomach turned. I rolled the windows up tight, though I knew it wouldn't help. The air inside had grown stale, heavy like breathing through damp cloth. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine's growl filling the silence like a warning. I kept thinking I'd missed something, some exit or service road where the car might have looped ahead of me. But there was nothing. The highway stretched unbroken, flanked by shadowed fields and dense black forest. No lights of houses, no distant towns, just the endless dark and that car that should not have been there. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. The dashboard clock told me it had only been another 40 minutes when I saw it a fourth time. By then the night had deepened into something that felt almost physical, like a weight pressing against the glass. My headlights seemed weaker, their beams swallowed by the dark instead of cutting through it. The asphalt shimmered faintly in places, as if wet, though the air outside was dry and cold. This time, the sedan sat just past a narrow overpass, its hazards dead, no light at all. It was nothing more than a silhouette, a hunched shadow with the faint curve of metal catching my high beams. As I approached, a flicker of movement stirred inside the car, something shifting behind the fogged rear window. I felt my chest tighten until it hurt to breathe. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The urge to look, to turn my head and see what was inside, was overwhelming, but some primal part of me screamed to keep my eyes forward. My foot stayed heavy on the gas until the car was nothing but a memory in the rearview mirror. The road seemed to stretch longer with each mile, as though I were moving through a loop that refused to end. My fuel gauge inched downward, the needle trembling near the last quarter tank. I considered pulling over, checking the map, anything to break the cycle, but the thought of stopping filled me with a cold so deep it bordered on nausea. When I finally saw lights, real lights, on the horizon, I nearly sobbed with relief. A small gas station appeared like a beacon, its faded sign glowing weakly against the dark. I pulled in too fast, tires crunching over gravel, and sat gripping the wheel until the engine's ticking cooled in the silence. The smell of gasoline and cold metal flooded my senses. The station was deserted. The pumps were old, the kind with cracked digital displays that flickered faintly but still worked. I filled the tank with shaking hands, the nozzle rattling against the car's frame. The night around me was utterly silent, no crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the hiss of fuel and the slow drip of condensation from the overhead lights. When I finally dared to look back at the road, I froze. Across the highway, parked at the edge of the gravel lot, sat the gray sedan. It hadn't made a sound. No engine, no tires on gravel, no blinking hazards this time. Just the dull gray shape, perfectly still, the back window fogged with that same faint, milky sheen. I couldn't see the driver's seat, but I felt the unmistakable weight of being watched. I left the pump half finished, jumped into my car, and drove without looking back. The tires skidded slightly as I hit the road, and for a brief, impossible second, I thought I saw a figure in the driver's seat of the gray sedan. A silhouette of someone sitting perfectly upright, head tilted slightly toward me, as if they had been waiting all along. I drove until the first streaks of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, until the night thinned and the world finally returned to something that felt real. By the time I reached the safety of a small roadside diner, my hands were cramped from gripping the wheel. I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe there were multiple cars that looked the same. Maybe exhaustion and darkness made me see connections that weren't there. But even now, weeks later, when I close my eyes, I can still smell that faint metallic tang, and I can still see the lazy flash of those hazards blinking patiently in the dark, waiting. I have worked night shifts for years, but there is something about a rural highway after midnight that still makes the air feel wrong. The silence carries a weight that isn't quite silence at all, more like a heavy pause, as if the world is holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. That night, I was the only patrol car assigned to a long stretch of county road that barely showed up on the GPS. A thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through endless woods. It was the kind of road where you could drive for miles without seeing another pair of headlights. The kind of place where the darkness doesn't just surround you, it absorbs you. The call came through the radio at 1:47 a.m. A faint, staticky crackle, the dispatcher's voice breaking apart and reforming in distorted fragments. A distress signal, a driver reporting a disabled vehicle and someone, standing in the trees. The caller's voice was thin and uneven, a breathless whisper that faded in and out like a dying signal. Before I could ask for a location, the transmission cut to static. I gave the dispatcher my acknowledgement, but when I asked for a repeat, there was nothing but dead air. It was strange enough, but stranger still was that the coordinates the dispatcher had on record pointed to a section of Route 6 that had no cell coverage. Not a dead zone in the casual sense. This was a place where no tower reached, a black hole for radio and phone signals. Yet somehow, a call had come through from deep inside it. The dispatcher's final words before the line went quiet were etched into my mind. Unit 12, the call's origin doesn't make sense. Proceed with caution. I turned off the main highway and onto the access road. The pavement immediately changed, rougher and patched with thin cracks that rattled through the steering wheel. Trees arched over the narrow lane, their branches like knotted fingers that scraped against the roof of the cruiser whenever the wind shifted. My headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, the beam swallowed whole just a few feet beyond their reach. Even with the windows up, I could smell damp earth and the faint, metallic tang of wet leaves. Somewhere far off, an animal cried out, high-pitched and thin, the sound of something small being hunted. The deeper I went, the more my radio sputtered. First came the faint pops of interference, then the hiss of static, finally complete silence. My phone lost its signal too, the bars dropping one by one until the screen showed only a single word: no service. I was alone now, a steel box of light and engine noise moving through a black sea. About 8 miles in, I saw it. A flash of pale gray cutting across the blacktop ahead. At first, I thought it was fog creeping low across the road, but as I slowed, I realized it was a car. A sedan, older model, parked on the shoulder at a crooked angle. Its hazard lights were off. The driver's side door stood open, swinging slightly with each faint push of the wind. My high beams washed over the trunk, revealing a thick coat of dirt and dried leaves clinging to the paint as if it had been sitting there for weeks. I stepped out of my cruiser, and the forest greeted me with a silence that felt engineered. No insects, no rustle of small animals. Even the wind seemed to stop. The air carried a damp chill that seeped through the fabric of my uniform and settled into my bones. My boots crunched on the gravel shoulder, every step too loud, too final. The car smelled faintly of gasoline and wet moss. I ran my hand along the door frame and felt a slick film, like condensation but sticky. The interior was empty. No keys, no wallet, no sign of a struggle, at least not an obvious one. But the driver's seat was pushed back farther than most people would set it, as though whoever had been sitting there wanted as much distance as possible between themselves and the steering wheel. The dome light above flickered weakly before dying altogether. I clicked my flashlight on and swept the beam across the interior. Dust motes floated lazily in the stale air. A child's car seat sat in the back, straps unbuckled, a small stuffed rabbit slumped against the side. Its fur was matted with something dark. I told myself it was mud. I radioed in my status, but the speaker only hissed back. I tried again. Nothing. The road behind me was a thin stripe of black that vanished into the trees. I couldn't shake the sensation that the woods were closer now, the trees leaning in, their trunks angled as if listening. I took a few steps toward the tree line, shining my light between the branches. Shapes shifted in the shadows, nothing defined, just the suggestion of movement, like something slipping deeper each time my light touched it. Then I heard it, a faint click, sharp and deliberate, like a tongue tapping against teeth. It came from somewhere deep in the woods. I froze, breath shallow, every muscle tight. Another click followed, closer this time, then a third, forming a slow, deliberate rhythm. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I swept the beam in a wide arc. The trees stared back with black, unblinking eyes of bark and shadow. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. For a moment, the forest was perfectly still. Then, from the direction of my cruiser, I heard a new noise, a soft hum, mechanical but wrong. I turned and saw my patrol car's headlights flicker on, though I was certain I had left them off. The engine was silent, but the lights pulsed in a slow, almost breathing rhythm, dimming and brightening in a pattern that didn't match any electrical fault I knew. I started back toward the cruiser, each step heavier than the last, as if the ground itself wanted to hold me there. The air thickened, wet and electric, carrying a faint smell of ozone and rot. When I reached the driver's door, I noticed the radio had come alive. Static poured from the speaker, layered with a faint voice buried deep inside it. Not words, just a low, stretched moan that rose and fell like something imitating human breath. The instant I touched the door handle, every sound stopped. The lights cut out. The forest fell into a silence, so complete I could hear the blood moving in my ears. Then, from the black void beyond the hood, came the soft crunch of a footstep. Not an animal, not the shifting of trees. A single, deliberate step on gravel. My flashlight beam wavered as I swept it across the road. Nothing, only the dark stretch of asphalt, empty and endless. I climbed into the cruiser and slammed the door. The locks clicked down by themselves before I could touch them. My fingers shook as I twisted the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life with a sound that felt louder than it should have, like it was fighting something unseen. As the headlights flared back on, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the woods. No details, just the shape of a person where a moment ago there had been nothing. I didn't stay to watch. I threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator until the tires screamed against the asphalt. The road unspooled ahead in a blur of gray and black. Branches whipped past like skeletal arms reaching for the cruiser. My radio stayed dead, my phone a useless slab of dark glass. The speedometer climbed, but the road refused to end. Each bend looked identical to the last, every mile marker swallowed by the dark. It felt like hours before I burst out of the tree line and onto the main highway. The instant I crossed the county line, the radio came back to life in a flood of static and overlapping voices. My phone lit up with bars of signal. The dispatcher's voice finally broke through, frantic, asking for my location, asking if I was safe. I gave my coordinates in a voice that barely sounded like my own. Later, they told me no call had ever been logged in the system. No driver in distress. No record of a vehicle on that road. When I returned with another unit after sunrise, the shoulder where I had found the sedan was empty. No tire marks. No rabbit. No sign that anything had ever been there. I still patrol that area from time to time, though I avoid that road whenever I can. And every so often, when I'm driving the lonely stretches after midnight, my radio will hiss for a split second. Not long enough to make out words. Just a brief, sharp crackle, like a breath trying to escape a dead signal. And I remember the figure at the tree line, standing motionless, watching as I fled. I remind myself it was probably just a trick of the dark. But sometimes, when the night feels heavier than it should, I catch the faintest smell of wet leaves and ozone inside the cruiser, and I know that road isn't finished with me.